Hi there. So welcome to Corporate Finance. If you're watching this video, this is probably your first serious encounter with corporate finance. And what I want to do in this introductory video, therefore, is give you an overall sense for what corporate finance is all about. And I'm going to start out with a bold, albeit a biased statement. This is a subject that you should care about. In fact, I'm going to change this to better. I think you better care about this subject. There are not a lot of subjects that you can say this for, but I can say this for finance. Look, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter what you want to do. At some point in your life, you're going to have to make decisions that involve money. That's just the way it is. And so if you think about finance in general, not corporate finance, but finance in general, finance is the study of two main questions. How do you make good investment decisions? And how do you make good financing decisions? And if you think about it, these two questions, the moment you're talking about money, these two questions are as relevant for people like you and I as they are for corporations, as they are for any other type of business, as they are for governments, as they are for nonprofits. Yeah, even nonprofits have to decide where they want to spend their money. Even nonprofits have to think about where they're going to get all that money from. And so my point is that people like you and I, it doesn't matter what we want to do, right? You may very well want to become an actor. That's fine. You may very well want to become a writer. You may very well never want to work for a corporation. Or maybe you're not a finance major. You're saying, I'm thinking of doing supply chain or HR, whatever. My point is, at some point you're going to be deciding about, should I buy this house? Should I buy this car? Should I invest in an MBA? That's an investment, right? Well, the fundamentals that you're going to learn here, how do we make good investment decisions, can probably help you. And how do you make good financing decisions? Think about an MBA. Okay, should I get a loan? A student loan? Does that make sense? How much of a loan? Should I use my life savings? These are questions that are equally important to people like you and I. And so my point is that corporate finance really is sort of a subset in a way that it's the study of these two fundamental questions just in the context of corporations. Why do we study corporate finance? Well, because most of us end up working for a corporation, or even if we want to start our own business, we ultimately want this business to grow and become hopefully a corporation. And so most of the economic activity that we see around is being done by corporations, so that's why the focus on corporate finance. But please, if you're new to finance, I would urge you to keep a broader sort of a mindset here, right? The principles that you're learning here can help you in your daily life as well. Don't just think corporations, okay? Now, with that said, one way in which we can shed a little bit more light on these two questions is by looking at a balance sheet. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into a balance sheet. I'm not going to talk about individual items that much. That comes later. But I want you to be able to reflect in these two questions, investment decisions and financing decisions, and the balance sheet does a good job of really exhibiting that. So what is a balance sheet? At a very, very basic level, in a balance sheet on the left-hand side, you see assets. What are assets? This is where the corporation's money has gone, right? And broadly, it's in two types of assets. They're either short-term assets or long-term assets. For example of short-term asset would be inventory. This is where the money is tied up, right? You spend some money. It's in some raw material now. It's not cash, but it's going to get converted into cash in a relatively short amount of time, usually less than a year. So you can think of this short-term asset as a short-term investment, right? It's a short-term investment, but it is an investment because money's out of your pocket. It's going to come back to you later. Okay. And then there's long-term investments, right? Long-term assets. So this is property, plant, and equipment, for example. A plant, a manufacturing facility, right? So these are all assets. What do you have on the right side? You have your liabilities. These, again, are either short-term, so short-term loans. Maybe the money you owe to your suppliers, right? That's a short-term loan as well, short-term liability, if you will. And then you have long-term debt, so long-term loans. And then you have equity, right? Equity is the money that the owners have put into the business. So again, you can broadly think about it as the initial equity. This is, well, we'll talk about it later. This is par value plus paid in capital. But very loosely speaking, this is the initial money that the equity holders, that the owners of the business put into the business. And then over time, as the business started generating money, right, then that you maybe used some of that and plowed it back or retained it back into the business. So that was your money, but instead of pocketing it, you said, hey, I'm going to put it back. That you're investing more of your money into the business. So that's equity as well. So that's addition to retained earnings. Look, again, without going too deep into the balance sheet, my main point is this. If you look at the left-hand side, the asset side, what is that? This is where money went. These are the uses of cash, or this is how you decided to invest your money as a corporation. This side reflects all your investment decisions. Doesn't matter whether it's in short term or long term. This is all your investment decisions, how you chose to use your money. And what's the nice thing about what's the truth about money, right? If you're using it, it's probably coming from somewhere. Where is it coming from? That's the right-hand side of the balance sheet. You're either borrowing short term, you're either borrowing long term, or you put in your own hard-earned money into the business. That's the sources. No wonder the balance sheet balances, because the uses of money have to match the sources of money. The two fundamental questions that we talked about, investment decisions and financing decisions, they're aptly captured by the left and the right-hand side of the balance sheet. So when we say that corporate finance is about how do you make good investment decisions, that's really about the composition of the left-hand side. How much in short term, how much in long term. Within long term, which specific assets should we have? Asset A, B, C, D, whatever. And so similarly for short term. And what sort of financing decision should we make? That's just the composition. That's the question of how should we compose the right-hand side? Should we have more equity, right? Or maybe less of equity, more of liabilities? If more of liabilities, should we have more short term or long term, right? Within equity, okay, if more of equity, should it be more initial and less of retained, or vice versa? I mean, these are important questions. Now, that said, sometimes what we do is that we say, okay, let's divide these two questions a little bit further into three questions. Okay, let's first talk about long-term or fixed assets. Okay, if we ask ourselves, how should we make good investment decisions, but more specifically now say, how should we make good long-term investment decisions? In other words, how should we think about, what should be the composition of, this side? This question of specifically focusing on long-term assets, this is the question of capital budgeting, right? So capital budgeting is an area of finance or corporate finance which deals with how should we make good decisions, good investment decisions about long-term investments. Okay. Then there is this question of how should we take on long-term debt? Should we? And we should. What kind of long-term debt? There are different types. Or should we focus on equity? All this stuff we say is a question of capital structure. Capital structure. So again, one example would be that, okay, maybe you've decided to invest in a house at a personal level. That's a long-term investment, okay? You chose house number 1 versus house number 2, 3, 4, 5. How did you make that decision? That's an investment of capital budgeting. And once you decided it's house number 1, okay, are you going to get a long-term loan, right? Or are you going to put in, some of your own money? How much of a loan? How much of your own money? That's a question of capital structure. Okay, so corporations, the same thing. Now you can probably see that there's a pattern here. I left out short-term assets here and short-term liabilities here. Because these tend to be short-term, we tend to focus on these exclusively and say, hey, this is sort of ongoing stuff that is happening. Inventory coming in, going out, coming in, going out. Short-term debt coming in, we paying back. Then occurring again, coming back, right? So talk about this separately under the question of working capital management. Working capital management. This is a working capital management. And so the two questions of finance, how do we make good investment decisions and financing decisions, we generally tend to look at them into more broadly into three. How should we make good long-term investment decisions? That's the question of capital budgeting. How should we make good financing decisions using long-term debt, paid-in capital, and in addition to retained earnings? This is the question of capital structure. And everything short-term falls into working capital management. So these are the three main questions that we're going to be talking about in corporate finance. Again, remember, if you're new to this or if this is your first serious encounter with corporate finance, more broadly, all of these questions and the answers that we will try to put forward for these questions, they apply just as much to you as they do to corporations. So stay tuned and we'll learn more.